WVOX. From Westchester and now all over the world.
1460 WVOX.
Stay tuned now for Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome to Westchester Eye on the Radio, our weekly discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. I'm John Sharan, with only one co-host this week, Ardina Seward. And Ardina, you've arranged for a special in-studio guest, so why don't you introduce him?
Joe Pinion, or Joseph Pinion, a.k.a. Joe Pinion, Yonkers resident and a young black Republican. Joe is running for the vacated assembly seat that Shelley Mayer had. And I want to say he's a maverick, but he's not, because he's been around in politics for a while, even at his young age. And we want to talk to him about the issues, why he is running, and the needs of the constituency that he plans to represent. So, Joe, I'm going to let you start off with introducing your platform. And let's start out with the question of why are you running for assembly person?
Well, so we probably started looking at it, made a hard determination in December after sitting down with my family, made a hard, soft announcement in March to get into this race, simply because I believe that Yonkers is on the wrong path. I believe that Yonkers has been fundamentally neglected, systemically neglected by the state of New York. You know, the main premise of our campaign is that Yonkers has invested in the state of New York, but the state of New York has not invested in Yonkers. And I think that issue by issue, you see this, a fundamental disregard for the humanity, for the dignity of our children, of our seniors. And there is really no other way to look at it. When you look at the fact that we've got Empire Casino that is, contributes more money to the state education fund than Mega Millions and Powerball combined. And yet we're 19th on the list of direct lottery recipients of those payments, of state formula that says that 80% of the resources generated by those casinos go to the state. Only 5% goes to the host city.
And we've seen from our past guests that twice in the last 3 weeks, rather, we've had representatives from the fire department and from the police department who've pointed out that there are going to be cuts presented by the
issue by issue. So again, at some point that piper has to be paid. I mean, again, it's systemic despair. I mean, as you talk about your compound neglect leads to compound despair. And that's what we have firemen and firefighters, our bestest, our bravest, our boldest, who are going to be hit the hardest. Obviously right now we're dealing with what is, borderline, call it a quality of life apocalypse.
Well, Ardina has pointed out that, there's a significant symbol of growth that is growing in the town. That you're seeing businesses grow, you're seeing a lot of opportunity. It would seem to be the exact opposite time of what you would want to do to cut back on services.
Well, yeah, I mean, you got over $1 billion in residential development to try to attract more families. How are you cutting 72 police officers when we need to have 100 more? When we have White Plains that has a larger police force than we have in Yonkers, a city that is the fourth largest city in this state. You're talking about having to close 2 firehouses. People will die. I'm not trying to use the rhetoric of fear, but that is just the human reality of what happens when you again start cutting at core fundamental services. I mean, we're not talking about electives here. We're talking about the things that literally mean the difference between living and dying. And so I think at some point, unfortunately, because the people that will bear the brunt of this are people who are, through no fault of their own, have been paying astronomical taxes, have sowed seeds in this city, had families in this city, but I think in this election, we're going to have the opportunity to have individuals come to the table and say, my goodness, what have we been doing? If you're a person who's been paying union dues to the fire department and saying, we have spent, close to $500,000 giving money to our Albany delegation, who mostly have been running in unopposed elections. They have all received promotions and raises, and all we have to show for it is a pink slip. That is, to me, a message that we can take to those individuals, that we can take to those police officers to say that what do you have to show for this investment in these local officials? We go back to 2012, not to make this a partisan because it's not partisan, it's just a reality. Andrew Stewart Cousins was a state senator. We had the other state senator was George Latimer. We had the assembly person who held the seat that I'm running for was Shelley Mayer. They have all received promotions and raises. And Yonkers does not have a single additional dollar in AIM funding to show for it.
And I had a chance to sit down with the union leaders yesterday Joe, and they are irate about what's happening with their contracts, with the potential of layoffs. And the problem, I want to say that it's complex, but complex may be the wrong term. I mean, you're talking about the equation, that the math just does not seem to add up. On one hand, you don't have enough cops, enough firemen to begin with to cover a city which has a population in excess of 200,000. But on the other hand, there are tax breaks being given to new businesses that basically are not compensating for the loss of revenue.
Here's the problem, right? Well, I think we're going to break.
We are. So you'll have to hold that thought, Joe. You're listening to not the Sons of the American Legion Radio Report. That was my previous show. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio here on WVOX 1460 AM. I'm John Sheeran, along with Ardina Seward, and our special in-studio guest, Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for the New York State Assembly seat that was formerly held by Shelley Mayer in Yonkers. And we're going to talk about what Joe would like to see happen in Yonkers, what his platform is going to be, right after a brief Fox News break and a brief Fox Business break. So they'll be back to back. But right after that, you will be back here at Westchester Eye on the radio here on WVOX 1460 AM. So stay tuned.
There's always something happening at 1460 on your radio.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the radio with Peter Moses, John Sheeran, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
We're back on the air. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio. And we forgot to mention earlier in the show, if you want to call in to comment or ask a question, the number is 914-636-0110. So we're in the studio with myself, Ardina Seward, John Sheeran, minus Peter Moses today, and our guest is Joe Pinion, who's running for the office of New York State Assemblyman. And
on the Republican ticket.
On the Republican ticket, which is very important to note because, as he had pointed out to me before we went on the air, that the last Republican to hold that spot was actually the now mayor of Yonkers, who was Mike Spanner, who at the time was a Republican. So it just goes to show you what a difference a day makes.
Ain't that the truth?
Joe, tell us a little bit about your background. Have you run for elected office before?
No, so I've never run for elected office before. I think if anyone had told me I was going to be running for elected office, this year, a year ago, I'd have told them they had lost their mind. But my background, I'm from New York, born and raised. I was born and raised in Yonkers, right around St. John's Avenue, right around the corner from Lincoln High School. Ended up going to Colgate University on an athletic grant, played football there, go Gate. And then, came back to New York, started working in the tech field. This was back kind of at the end of the tech boom. And then, worked on a sports video website, with a couple of friends from high school. And, long story short, all of a sudden Bear Stearns was going out of business. Lehman Brothers was going out of business. And we were being incubated at the time by General Motors, who, funny enough, all of a sudden they're in D.C. asking for more money to prop up the American auto industry, and the auditors are looking at their books saying, "You're spending $3 million a year on a sports video website. How's that working out with taxpayer dollars?" So, long story short, that ended that journey, but kind of thrust me back kind of into the political sphere. Was very engaged with community organizations, the Young Republicans in Manhattan, also here in Westchester. Ended up being working on outreach, trying to create more diversity within the GOP caucus with the National Federation of Young Republicans. Ended up helping to co-found an organization called the Conservative Color Coalition, trying to make the conservative message more hospitable for people who are ethnic, racial, religious minority groups. So in that process, ended up working in the nonprofit sector, particularly with youth development, trying to make sure that we were providing wraparound services for our youth. So I ended up spearheading a program. We were providing scholarships for at-risk youth to help bridge gap, help provide bridge funding for them to be able to go away to college, because there's a lot of students, particularly here in New York City, that don't have that extra $2,000, $3,000. And that's the difference between them staying home or being able to go away and have a full college experience. So did a lot of that work, and in that process, worked on a couple campaigns, in a very roundabout way, ended up becoming a pretty regular political contributor on CNN, Fox News Radio, Sirius Radio. And so, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of what happened. And then to present day when, I say it was all fun and games until my mother retired about 2 years ago. And suddenly I'm the only child, and I'm getting these bizarre text messages from a woman that can barely text saying, I don't know what I'm going to do about these property taxes.
Now, tell us a little bit, Joe. I mean, it's unusual, especially in Yonkers, to see somebody choosing to run on the Republican ticket. What about the Republican platform appeals to you?
Well, to me, look, I've been a Republican, pretty much my whole life. So if people say, why do you choose to run as a Republican? I say, well, first and foremost, because I'm a Republican.
So again, that gets back to the philosophy.
The philosophy, which is that, I believe in small government. I believe that localized government, is the way to go. I think, and the issues that are plaguing Yonkers are a clear illustration of that. When you're literally taking the dollars out of the pockets of the people that live in Yonkers, when you're literally sending our dollars from Empire Casino up 87 to be redistributed around to other districts around the state for their children to have educational prosperity, while our children are literally trying to learn algebra in decommissioned locker rooms that have holes in the roof, and they're getting rained on in algebra class, which is not hyperbole. That's actually what's happening.
Which doesn't even go into the account of the quality and the newness of textbooks and other
and all those other things. And so, that's to me is the real reason why I believe in the Republican cause. I believe that anytime that we pass new laws that only make people feel better, not see either increase safety or increase liberty, I think that we're doing the public a disservice. And so those are just kind of I guess if you're talking about from a principle standpoint or just a tenet standpoint, the reasons why I've always leaned right, so to speak. I consider myself a center-right individual. Mm-hmm. I just think that, again, when we start talking about fiscal conservatism, when you start talking about putting the control of people's lives in the hands at the most local level possible, I think that is when you start to see progress for all people, irrespective of their needs, start to accelerate.
Now, if you were elected, what would you do your first 3 months in office?
So first 3 months, one of the first thing I'm trying to do is make sure that we actually sunset the Yonkers personal income tax. Yonkers has a personal income tax, as I'm sure you know, that exists literally nowhere else in the state outside of New York City. If you go on TurboTax right now, the first question they'll ask you if you're a New York resident is, do you live in Yonkers? Why? Because we have this tax that exists nowhere else. To me, it is a vestige of our, unfortunate racial history. We go back to 1984. We got this tax on the heels of the federal government suing the city of Yonkers in 1980, saying that we had segregation in our public housing and segregation in our public schools. Well, you fast forward to today, we have our public school system that is more segregated today than it was when the federal government sued us. We're spending over $40 million a year on busing, sending children from one side of Yonkers to the other side of Yonkers to create racial diversity that, statistically speaking, cannot exist, because 76% of the children that attend Yonkers public schools right now are black and brown children. Right? And that doesn't even account for the fact that that's over $100 million that should be in the pockets of the people that live in Yonkers, that is being used in the most pernicious manner to justify the underfunding that we get from Albany, because Albany looks at that tax as an asset and then points to that asset as to why we can't actually receive the just funding that we would be entitled to if we were living in any other zip code.
Now, you bring up an interesting point, and I think you just touched on it. I was going to say, if we're concerned about the amount of money that is going to Yonkers and we don't think it's enough, taking away this tax would certainly reduce that. So what you're saying is, if you take that tax away, you now take away the opportunity for the folks in Albany to say, aha, you have an extra source of income.
It's almost like to me, it's funny because all things come back to Westchester.
Sure.
It's how in Westchester, we literally have people who are homeless. And we force those people to literally pay money to the county for them to stay in homeless shelters, which is the most backwards thing you can imagine. Because it's crazy. Because the more money you allow the people to keep, if they're responsible, the faster they can get out of the shelter and back on their own 2 feet. And it's the same thing with Yonkers. The fact that, again, you are literally taking money out of the pockets of the people who live in Yonkers, the people who were not a retirement village, the people who buy the most bread in Yonkers live in Yonkers, the people who buy the most beer in Yonkers live in Yonkers. And so ultimately you're left in a situation where people can't pay the mortgage, get foreclosed on, can't cut the lawn, and they can't build on the addition. And so if we get rid of that, that money goes back into the opportunity has the opportunity to rise all across the city of Yonkers.
And we're going to pick up that discussion on the other side of the break. Stay with us, folks. We're coming into our final half hour. You listen to Westchester Eye on the radio.
America's great community station.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the Radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to this week's discussion of issues relating to Westchester and the surrounding area. Our special guest today is Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for the New York State Assembly seat formerly held by Shelley Mayer. And Joe is telling us a little bit about his points of view on fiscal issues and other issues relating to Yonkers. And Joe, I'm wondering, do you really think that you'll be able to convince the folks at Albany to get rid of the Yonkers income tax and to therefore change their attitude and perhaps give more of the money that is generated in Yonkers back to Yonkers?
I do believe that. I think that the reality is that the hidden text on that 1984 decision when the state gave the statutory authority to Yonkers to levy the tax is that it had a sunset date. That sunset date is 2019. That is next year.
Really?
That's on the ballot.
I didn't realize that.
So literally, that's a lifetime ago. Literally, my entire lifetime, from the year I was born into present. Again, we've been struggling to meet this tax. So we have an opportunity. I mean, again, part of the reason why I got in this race is because people say, well, you can do a lot of things on the civic level, and I said, look, there are a lot of things coming up on the ballot this year that can only be remedied in Albany. One, starting with this personal income tax that has a sunset date. You start looking at the fact that the moratorium on full gambling is supposed to be lifted. There was a 7-year moratorium that's getting ready to be lifted. So that's going to have an opportunity to, again, reopen that whole thing. Will Yonkers have the opportunity to have full gambling?
And
now
with
these sports,
I was going to say, this past week we had the sports.
With the sports thing, there's a massive opportunity now to start driving new revenue into that casino. Also an opportunity to revisit the formula, which says that 80% goes to the state, only 5% goes to the host city, right? If Yonkers was getting just 8%, instead of that 5%, we wouldn't have any funding issues in Yonkers at all, right? So issue by issue, people say, oh, well, you can't get rid of this tax. There's so many things that are embedded in our legislation that even if you can't fix the broader issue, you can still get stuff done. There's, people always thought, it's the running joke now, is that anyone running for office in Yonkers is going to start talking about, oh, well, Yonkers gets 70%, and Albany and Rochester and Buffalo are always going to get 98% reimbursements on capital investments. And I say, look, even if you work from the basic premise that you're just one assembly person, you can't fix that. I don't need to fix that to be able to make sure that Yonkers is treated fairly. We have a hold harmless provision at the state level, which says that no school district can receive less money than they did the year before, irrespective of enrollment. That is just stupid. Right? You're talking about a time right now where school enrollment is down statewide 6% at a time where Yonkers is the fastest growing school district in the state outside of New York City. So a proposal like that literally hampers and hinders Yonkers disproportionately more than it does any other place. Right? And so I can go to, other assembly people. I can go to people in the state senate. There are 219 districts in this state, 216, my apologies, that have exceeded their target range for, target educational funding based on the last audit, right? So we can go to those other districts and say, look, yes, it helps me more, but your children are being hampered too. When we talk about school choice, we're talking about letting the dollars follow the students, right? And that's not just a charter school thing. That's just across the board, saying that if there are more students in Yonkers and there are less students apparently in a district in Long Island, then why don't we allow those dollars to follow the new influx of students? That's just common sense.
How do you plan to convince the representatives from those other areas to give up money?
The reality is that there are more people who are being shafted than people who are receiving more money.
Okay.
And so again, as one voice in 155, as a Republican in a super minority right now, yeah, that seems very daunting. But dollars talk. And when you start going to those other people and saying, look, your district is being affected too, person by person by person. And I think when you start talking about the fact that we don't know what's going to happen in the Senate, but right now there is a Republican majority, to be able to go and say, let the dollars follow the students, I think that that's something that will resonate with them.
Now the local government in Yonkers is quite democratic.
Yes.
And the reality is you'll have to work with them. Do you think that their attitudes about funding will match yours, or do they have a different attitude there?
I don't care.
Understood. But you have to work with them.
Well,
You have to work with
the
them.
reality is that, again, we are facing a quality of life apocalypse, right? If we can go to Albany and figure out a way to say that even something, again, as simple as saying books, textbooks right now,
Sure.
and tech and iPads, things of that nature, are reimbursed equally to every district, irrespective of need. Again, that is something that hampers a city like Yonkers. It has an adverse effect on Yonkers compared to a place like Chappaqua. Chappaqua doesn't need the same dollar-for-dollar reimbursements on books that Yonkers does. That just doesn't make any sense, right? So if you're going to say that the local government is going to go and say this individual who is fighting to change the coefficient in formulas to make sure that more dollars are flowing into Yonkers is a bad thing. If you're going to be an individual who says that let us hold on to any additional dollars, if someone after 35 years has the ability to go up there and find a way to allow a personal income tax that has a sunset date to actually sunset and put that money back in the pockets of the citizens of Yonkers, and you're going to write a letter on behalf of the city to say no, good luck getting reelected next year. Because I think that's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do when you're laying off people left and right and people are literally forced to make, life and death decisions or basically, stay or flee decisions when it comes to living in and raising families in Yonkers.
I was going to say, if people want to find out more about Joe Pinion and his opinions and his policies, is there a website or social media?
Yes, you can go to joepinion.com, where you can find our introductory video. We also have a section there called Talk to Joe, where you can go out there. You can literally sign up to have a conversation with me on any issue you choose.
And that's P-I-N-I-O-N?
P-I-N-I-O-N, like opinion without the O. So yeah, joepinion.com. You can find anything you want to find on me. You can also find us on social media at Pinion4NY on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. So you can do that. You can also find our content on YouTube as well.
Okay, and I want to go back to your hypothetical first 3 months in office.
Yes.
You're in office. Now you're facing a city that has laid off 72 cops, 30 firemen, 251 school-related personnel, many of whom may indeed have to seek social services. And I was also informed yesterday, interesting enough, that for the firefighters who may indeed be laid off will not receive any health care. So you're talking about 30 young men who will not have health care. And
their families as well.
And their families as well. That is a loss of revenue. It puts the city in peril. And these things tend to have a ripple effect. Because you know as well as I do that in the summer, it becomes party time. And all of a sudden, the crime rate starts to spike. Then you have the fires that happen in the winter. But going back to your hypothetical first 3 months, if you inherit a district that has reduced services to schools, lack of teachers, lack of policemen, and the crime goes up, at some point, that's got to affect the bond rating of the city.
Well, yeah, I think that the reality is that right now we are on the precipice. We are on the precipice of, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, coming back under state control. I think that is just the reality of these numbers. And part of that, again, a large part of that goes to the fact that we've been underfunded for so long. And so, to your point, yes, to me, it's crucial that we have a tax that has a sunset date, right? So it's not like I'm going up there and trying to convince a whole bunch of people to do something that wasn't already projected. It has a sunset date. They would have to actually renew the tax, right? And so this is something to be able to say, no, the tax has a sunset date, let it die. And why don't you do today what you should have done 40 years ago in Yonkers, which is fully fund this. I mean,
but let me interrupt you for a second, Joe, because you know something. There's no Albany does not have to. Albany does not have to play ball with Yonkers. Whether they should and whether they can are two different things. Because you're too young to remember, but I think John, I remember that back in the 70s, that headline in the Daily News: Ford tells city then President Ford tells the city to drop dead. Because New York City was in the middle of a fiscal crisis. Yep. It's somewhat parallel to what's happening in Yonkers' relationship to New York State. And they went through this, the crime, the whole 9 yards. And they went and the feds just said, it's your ball of wax. You made your bed hard. You got to sleep in it. We're not giving you any money. Right. Now, eventually, they came around and they did bail New York City out. But the point I'm trying to make is that there was a period of chaos, turmoil, and apocalyptic yields that happened in that time.
I mean, we're dealing with unprecedented pain and anguish in the city of Yonkers, and it's about to get worse. We have an Albany delegation that hasn't showed up to any of our public hearings, that doesn't even seem to acknowledge that there's a problem. I mean, if there's a person in Yonkers listening right now, I'll just say, I'm sorry, because clearly they haven't. It is tragic what is happening here, that the families of those police officers are going to be the ones that are hit the worst, hardest. What the families of those firemen are going to get hit the hardest. Because, again, their parents aren't going to have jobs, and their teachers won't be around to teach them, right? That is a double whammy on top of the fact that all the children of Yonkers are going to be adversely hurt by this. So we just have to find a way. Again, can one assembly person do everything by himself? No, I do not believe I alone can fix it, but I do believe that there are ways to utilize common sense approaches to look at these things at a numerical basis, at the foundational basis, and start making sure that we do the work necessary to get Yonkers the respect and dignity that they deserve.
And that's a good point to end before we take this break, before our final quarter hour. You're listening to Westchester Eye on the radio. Our special guest today, Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for the New York State Assembly. And you can find out more about him at joepinion.com. We'll be back right after a brief Fox News break, so stay tuned.
1460 VOX. On the right side of your radio dial.
1460 WVOX.
Let's return now to Westchester Eye on the radio with Peter Moses, John Sharan, and Ardina Seward on 1460 WVOX.
Welcome back to Westchester Eye on the radio. Our final quarter hour is about to begin. Our special guest here today is Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for New York State Assembly from Yonkers. And Joe, have you made any connections, any alliances with anybody in Albany yet? Because obviously that's where you want to work. Do you know the people there? Are you going to be able to work with them?
Well, look, I mean, I've had the opportunity to speak to over just the work that I've done in media, the work that I've been able to do with regards to just in politics in general. So I have a pretty good relationship with individuals on both sides of the aisle, both in the Assembly and the Senate. So I do believe that there is a pathway for me to be able to work with people if I'm fortunate enough to represent the city of Yonkers and Albany. And I think that irrespective of those issues, I think that it's simply about what's in the best interest of the people. We've made these things so completely, nonsensically partisan for absolutely no reason. The fact of the matter is, particularly at the state level, there are so many things that unite the needs of people from towns and villages to cities like Yonkers. Yonkers is the fourth largest city in the state. It is one of the 115 largest cities in the country. The solutions that we provide here can be a blueprint for how we begin to heal cities all across this country. But we have to be committed to doing that in a manner that is not partisan and simply about what's best serving the people.
And Joe, I was just going to say one thing. It's just a purely personal thing from me. I thank you for properly. This is the grammarian in me. I thank you for properly using the word irrespective. Too many people use a word that does not exist. There is no such thing as irregardless. There is irrespective and there is regardless, but there is no such thing as irregardless. And Joe, you get kudos from me for being a good grammarian.
Oh, he's a scholar.
That English major came out for some good use.
And speaking, you spoke earlier about healing and working across party lines. Now, the Republican Party bears a stigma, and as some would consider it, of Trump. Now, I don't know where you stand as far as your opinions of Trump, but Trump in some camps is a PR problem. So, as a Republican, how do you dispel that image going forward?
Well, look, I often say right now, particularly, the reality is that there's a great deal of animosity towards our president, and that has a vast impact on what is happening with our city, on our party. Having said that, the 40 years of chronic underfunding that we're dealing with in Yonkers have absolutely nothing to do with the year and a half that President Trump has been in D.C.
And they're bigger and more immediate.
And they're bigger and more immediate. I say that, I've said it many times, that right now in Westchester in particular, when you look at obviously what happened in the election with Rob Astorino and George Latimer, even if you look at what happened with Shelley Meyer and Julie Killian, Westchester does have a blue wave. I said, but that blue wave crests on the shores of Yonkers. Because the fact remains is that, you know, if you live in a community that is filled with 3-car garages, you can choose to ignore your local needs and send a national message. Yonkers is a community of 1-car garages with too many cars to fit in the driveway. We have immediate, imminent needs. We have firefighters that are going to lose their jobs. We have police officers that are going to lose their jobs. We have teachers that just now actually were able to raise the graduation rate at a market level for the first time in a very long time in Yonkers that are now going to be sent packing. That is a dire, dire recipe for disaster when you start talking about how do you grow and build a vibrant city. And so I think that, again, yes, there are issues in D.C., and I understand that. And I've been very vocal, you know, on this radio station, you know, on national television about where I stand on many of those issues. But none of that means, you know, a can of anything, you know, when you start talking about the fact that people are literally having to face down the reality that they can't afford to live in the city that they love. The fact that there are homeowners like my mother that are sitting here, work their entire life to be able to afford a home and build a family, and now face their retirement age, wondering if they're even going to be able to stay there. And that is the message that I hear when I go door to door talking to people in our community who are just sick and tired of Yonkers being taken advantage of and getting the short end of the stick.
And some of Yonkers' woes are due to financial mismanagement. There was a report that the Napoli issued, I believe, a couple of weeks ago, which talks about the financial mismanagement. So should you become that assembly person, it's going to take a year or more to unravel all of the complications and all of the missteps within that financial construct. So how do you do that? How do you get that additional $10,000, which is buried somewhere under misspent $10 million?
I can't. And I think that fixing the problem is being able to recognize that, accept it, and say it loudly and publicly. Your assembly person cannot force your mayor or your city council people to be more responsible. I think that what happens, particularly at the local level, is that you have a con game, a misdirection game, where your Albany delegation points their fingers at the city. The city points their fingers at Albany. And everybody is responsible, so nobody is to blame. And people need to start having the ability to understand who is responsible for what, right? When your assembly person starts coming home and saying that they want to, you know, have background checks on guns extending from 3 days to 10 days, that is not a serious solution about keeping your children safe. That is someone who is attempting to bribe you for your vote, because all that is an extra 7-day lease on life. That is not a serious solution, right? You have individuals who are walking around here with all types of random proposals, you know, saying that we're going to, you know, we're going to send a letter to Con Edison. I mean, I remember specifically it was the newsletter that Shelley Meyer sent out last spring, where she said that she was upset about what was going on with the Con Edison rates, and she was going to write a letter. And that was the moment where I knew I needed to run, because I can write a letter. My mother can write a letter. Any citizen can write a letter. If you're in Albany as an elected official, you can actually change the manner in which the state interacts with Con Edison. So when I have George Latimer, our illustrious, you know, county executive, holding these sham rallies with all these elected officials, all these local elected officials who can do absolutely positively nothing to affect change as to how the state regulates Con Edison, talking about, oh my gosh, things are so terrible, as if he hadn't been a creature of Albany year after year after year, and somehow the word Con Edison never came out of his mouth when he was in Albany and could do something about it. I mean, it's a joke. And so, I don't say that to be partisan. I mean, it's just a reality, because basically the entire local and state delegation of Westchester and in Yonkers is Democratic. But I do say it to say that as citizens, we have to be able to say, I elected you to do X, and you have failed to do it. So give me a reason why I should give you another chance, or maybe it's time for you to step aside. I would be embarrassed to ask for additional time if I were in the Albany delegation right now, to sit here and say that you have given me hundreds of thousands of dollars to run in campaigns, and now you're forcing layoffs. You're forcing being bumped down. I don't understand how people can, with a straight face, ask for continued support from the people.
Well, this goes to the point. Do you think that the status quo of Yonkers is due to just a lack of inertia, on the part of politicians because they felt that nothing was going to be done anyway, and they were just going along to get along and get their salaries.
And Joe, give us the 45-second answer.
Well, 45-second answer. My grandfather always said, all money is not good money, and be wary of people who act as if some money is better than no money. That is, to me, what is happening in Yonkers. The reality is that you have politicians who have accepted the fact that Albany will never be treated fairly, and thus they'll be grateful for whatever crumbs they have to spare. That, to me, is a recipe for disaster. That, to me, is unacceptable. That is why I'm in this race, to give people a chance to have a choice again for the first time. We've had uncontested elections all over Yonkers for years, and it's done. We're not doing that again because it's too important, and this election is too valuable.
And Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for New York State Assembly from Yonkers, he can be found online. You can find out more about him at joepinion.com, JoePinion.com. And Ardina, who is our guest next week?
I'm excited to say we're going to have Quay James, whose name has practically become a household name. This is a young guy whose Facebook post went viral, and he had to apologize for it, and he has a very, very important message. Young guy on the road to fame, popularity, and the good days.
And you've been listening to Westchester Eye on the radio here on WVOX 1460 AM and heard worldwide at WVOX.com. I'm John Charan along with Ardina Seward, and we thank today's special guest, Joe Pinion, Republican candidate for New York State Assembly. Until next week, everyone, have a great week and enjoy the day.